Sparrows Point, near Baltimore, Maryland. The first furnace was built there in 1887, 22 years after the Civil War's end. By the 1950s and 60s, Sparrows Point had become the world's largest steel mill, stretching 4 miles from end to end and employing 30,000 workers. Essentially, it was a town with its own culture, schools, police force, and recreational areas. For more than a century, the mills at Sparrows Point turned out steel by the ton. The immense operation helped supply a nation and employ generations of Marylanders. But much of that productivity predated modern environmental regulations, leaving a peninsula that is arguably the most complex cleanup site in the state, if not the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. And it is just one of hundreds of properties across Maryland that has been or is being cleaned up, in many instances for job-creating reuse, under the oversight of the Maryland Department of the Environment. Barbara Brown and Jennifer Sons of MDE have overseen much of Sparrows Point's transformation over the years.
Sparrows Point was unusual in that it was an integrated steel mill. It took all the ore and coke and made pig iron and then made steel, and it's 3,000 acres, which on paper, doesn't look like much, but when you're actually walking around in there and you're actually seeing the equipment move around and the size of the blast furnace and all the different buildings, it's pretty impressive. The other interesting thing about Sparrows Point is it wasn't just a industry, it was a culture. It was where families worked, where fathers and sons worked, where uncles worked. It was a way to make a good living. It was, there was a lot of pride in what they did. The work was dirty and dangerous, and if you read some of the books on the history of it, there was a sort of a caste system of even where you lived in the company town. It was still running, and it ran for a couple more years, and then the too big to fail failed. So in 2012 they did the last shutdown of the blast furnace, and then we moved into the demolition phase, the bankruptcy phase, and moving forward. And all along, it's one of these sites too that's been with MDE for years. You go back and you look through the files and you see all the oil spills and this spill, and they were dealing with Kish. The people in Dundalk in that area, dealt with the red particles that was from the molten slag being dumped, and it would go into the air, and it would fall on cars, and people would have to wash their cars, and it would, you'd read too about how people would only, hang their wash on certain days when certain things were going on, so they didn't have, red stained. So there was a lot of air. Even when we were at Browning Highway, you could look over the bridge and see that, the cloud that was around Sparrows Point. So I guess at a certain point, the department decided, hey, you're not going to run like it's the Wild West. You've got to basically start complying with all these environmental regulations now. You just can't have a landfill that's a dump. And on a parallel track, there was different ownership, 3 or 4 different owners. Some of the owners were very good about doing environmental stuff, but those last couple of years, money, they weren't even doing maintenance on the equipment, and money for environmental just wasn't there. So that's the sort of the state of it when I got involved with it.
I did get to see it before they raised all the buildings, and it was very immense and surprisingly city-like once you got down off of 695 into actually the steel mill. So when I came back in 2014, 2015 to work for the voluntary cleanup program, and Sparrows Point was my main project, I went out to the site and it was completely most, if not every single building was gone. It's very, very large, very, very flat. It was incredibly difficult to even imagine how it had been. I appreciated having seen it in its, not glory, but in its build out, just to understand the immense scale. Because when you do look at the 3,100 acres on a map, I think one of the hardest things for people to do is understand that scale. A lot of, I think, VCP sites tend to be 2 acres, a half acre, because they're in the city. And then you have this entire peninsula that is Sparrows Point. I entered a cubicle that was wall-to-wall files that was organized as best it could be. And I spent a lot of time when I first got here getting to know the file and just trying to get an understanding of the history. And it was a lot of inspection reports at the beginning, RCRA files, the KISH related files, kind of emergency calls was a lot of what they did. They just kind of managed things as they came up.
Yeah, that's the one thing about this is when you work at a certain part of MDE, you work in oil, you work in permits, you deal with your group, your function, your part of the regulations. With Sparrows Point, both Jennifer and I, it's multimedia. So we've met over the last, since 2009, I've met people from solid waste because there's landfill issues. We've met people from permitting. We've had issues with non-tidal wetlands. They want to go dredging, so we've met those people that we've interacted with. We have the NIPTES permit people, the stormwater management people, people from Baltimore County. So working on this project, it's not only with other, federal agencies, county agencies, and meeting just a whole and understanding what a whole bunch of other folks in MDE do. When they started doing the demolition, we had again a group of MDE people go out, and it was kind of amazing because we had a group of about 20 and we're walking around all the different agencies, and we found all sorts of issues that they were having with water discharges. Probably the most serious one was Lorraine's group with asbestos, because the asbestos workers were not doing things properly. When you'd go there and you'd see all this wreckage and all this material, it almost looked like one of those sci-fi movies where they had what was left of the blast furnace laying there, and so just picture a ginormous excavator that you can't even barely see because it's down in the pit. So just that whole demolition was at least a 4-year process. The rod Meyer mill to the north that had cadmium and zinc, the coke ovens to the south on that peninsula is mostly benzene and toluene free product. There's a lot of places where there was oil, because they did use a lot of cutting oil, hydraulic oil, oil fired this and that and the other thing. So a lot of it actually is oil related. We've got some chlorinated solvents, we've got a landfill, so there's a little bit of everything. You just never, when you're walking around out there, you just never know what you're gonna find.
And with development, they dig and they find, areas of contamination that they have to deal with, and we've worked on a process for them reporting that to us and then sampling to see what they need to do, and then they get approvals for whether or not they need to take it away or they can reuse it on site.
So Tin Mill Canal was basically they filled in Humphrey's impoundment with slag, and it conveyed all the goo and oil and everything from the milling steel mill, the rolling mills and all the mills, and then it just basically went out to the Patapsco and Bear Creek for years, because the solution to pollution was dump it in the water somewhere. And TPA went in and scraped all the oily stuff out of it and cleaned it up. But now, you still got 60 acres of goo and metals and PCBs that, came out in history, and that's going to have to be cleaned up. And that, people were worried about the crabs and the fish, and it was a pretty major endeavor. the first couple of public meetings, when we had the consent decree that MDE and EPA we'd have over there at the library, we'd have a room full of people, because everybody's like, well, what's happening? You know, I had the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, you had Blue Water, you had people that had lived in the area, and they, wanted to know what was going on, and I think they'd probably heard the song and dance for years, oh, we're gonna get this place cleaned up. And so the first couple of meetings were interesting. As time went on, and we had some of our open houses, people were less and less. I think they got a certain level of comfort. And
I think once everything was down, all of the buildings were down, all of the big demolition had been done, so all those dust issues and those kinds of issues were gone. And Tradepoint did a really good job of kind of showing their vision for the future. I think that helped people see that this was moving forward. I do think that the location of Sparrows Point, right off of 695, I mean, you can see the entire site when you're coming over the Key Bridge, so people would be coming back and forth from wherever jobs or errands they were running, and they would see, oh, this is different today. So it was, it's very out there in the open. It was very easy to see when a building would go up. It kind of changed the landscape quickly.
so when it first started, it's like, okay, now what do we do with all this? And then when those first couple of public meetings, we working out with EPA. Okay, here's what you're going to do. Here's what you're going to do. Here's MDE's responsibility. Here's just EPA. So it's sort of evolved organically, I guess you would say, how we're dealing with things.
Right. Well, when they first started, it was all investigation. It was all phase 2 investigations. That was a very specific type of work. You're reviewing work plans. You're making sure that the public sees the work plans. You're making sure that they have enough coverage that they're going to get a good idea of what they're dealing with within each parcel that they're doing a phase 2 investigation on.
We went to one of the public meetings before COVID, and this lady people were standing up and talking about what they did at the plant, and this one lady stood up and she says, well, I was a hooker. And everybody's like, looking at her, and no, she was very proud of the fact that she was one of the first lady employees, and her job was to get on top of the stacks of stuff, and when the crane hook came down, she hooked the load up. So you had to make sure that was done, and so everybody was very proud of what they did there, and a lot of the people that we met there that had worked there for years. So and then it was kind of sad to hear when it did go, people committed suicide because they were in their 50s and they didn't know what they were going to do, or and all the pension stuff. But now there's optimism. You read their Facebook page, people are excited. Tradepoint's giving Baltimore County land for a park, so they're going to get some new soccer fields. They've donated to some of the schools. They seem to be, we're local people, we want to be involved in the community. Sparrows Point isn't done. There's a lot of work left to do. The buildings might be up, it might be built out, but there's going to be some major decisions on what you clean up, where you clean up, and that's going to have to be presented to the public. And there might be some pushback on that. Is this clean enough? Is it too clean? How much money are you going to spend to clean up? Where do you clean up? How long are you going to clean up? So there's a whole lot of decisions between MDE and EPA coming up. And then the final paperwork is doing all the
Land use controls,
environmental covenants, closure documents, and it's like, I'm skedaddling. I'm leaving that to her. So. We had never done anything like this size and this many parcels, and even TPA, when they took it over with the 2014 consent decree, they originally said, oh, we're not going to sell any parcels. It's all going to be industrial. And one thing about working on this project is you really need to be able to pivot, and you really need to be able to respond. So like Jennifer said, their first attempt at dividing it up, they was like, okay, well, we'll divide and conquer with these parcels. But then they have tenants come in that say, well, I don't want all of that parcel, or I want this, or I want that. So when they first started out, you've got some big money behind TPA with the Redwood investors and things like that, and the first tenant, who wants to build on a Superfund site. So TPA had to do a lot of work with look at you've got the water, you've got rail, you've got 695, that this is a great place to come, here's wide open spaces. So the first tenant was FedEx, and that was a big, big deal. So then we had to sort of learn the process for combining the consent decree, the voluntary cleanup process, doing the RAP, doing the investigation. And once FedEx was in there, then it seemed like then a lot of other people started wanting to go in there.
And now when you go out to the site and you see FedEx, it looks very small. And because FedEx was 200,000 square feet.
Yep.
And then right next door to it, Amazon is there now, but it was a spec building when they built it, is 400,000 square feet. And McCormick is 1 million cubic square feet.
Oh yeah, the scale of the steel mill was amazing, but when you go into these warehouses now that they've built, like they've got Home Depot, they've got Floor Decor, McCormick's going to be 1.5 million square feet.
Under Armour is there.
Yeah, they built the spec building that Amazon took, and you walk into these buildings and it's just like, you just wish you had a pair of roller skates, because it's just like acres of concrete in front of you, and it's like. And then, you see with the Amazons and some of these other ones that get filled up with the conveyor belts, and Home Depot has the train tracks that come through there that they can unload the lumber. And
there is still a lot left to do. The groundwater is complicated, which is why it's taken so long for us to get here. And it's kind of, when you look at the groundwater issues, you think development was easy. And the development will obviously continue. They have lots of grand plans that change every 6 months, and we will continue to be flexible where we can, while still, keeping the state's interests at the forefront. And EPA, working with EPA, that will continue. I get a little nervous when I think about all the institutional knowledge that's not very far from retirement. EPA and MDE, both of us, both agencies, even TPA, some of the people, including Pete Haid, you never know. It would be sad to hear he was going to retire, just because, you work on something with somebody or people for so long, you kind of get used to them knowing everything. So I think the future is
in good hands.
In good hands, but open, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes.